Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed Live. We have a super exciting episode planned for you today, and so without further ado, we're going to get right into it. And today our topic is going to be Azure Monitor for SQL Insights, and we have brought in the leader of this suite of tools, Alain Dormehl. Alain, thanks so much for joining us today. Can you tell folks a little bit about, what you do?
Sure. Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me today. So I'm a PM in the Azure SQL database team, and so one of the features that I look after is the monitoring portfolio for all of our Azure-based deployments of SQL, and that's primarily what we're going to cover in today's session.
Awesome, great. We are happy to have you on the show. And just for our viewers that are maybe tuning in for the first time or tuning in from wherever you're tuning in, Learn TV, Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, we do want to let you know that we are monitoring everything that you say that's coming in from those streams. So if you want to comment or question, we would love to answer your questions as well. And yes, you're welcome for doing this. And, also thanks, Alain, for coming on the show. I think this is going to be a good show. This is something that's, generating a lot of buzz in our community. So I guess maybe, Alain, to kick it off, it'd be good if you could give us some background on, maybe before Azure Monitor SQL Insights, what did monitoring your Azure SQL resources look like?
Sure, and I mean that's a great question to sort of start off with, right? So there's what you're going to do is you're actually going to take a step back from that. You're going to look at SQL Server, and you're going to think about how our customers and partners have always sort of looked at their database workloads, right? So within the SQL ecosystem, you have a bunch of complexity that already lives there where monitoring is concerned, right? So we have things like DMVs, which are almost like static metrics inside the database. You have X events, which are like trigger-based events that happen in the system. And then you have logs, which kind of explains what all of this is, right? So like, oh, there was an error that happened. I need to link that back to something else, and I need to be able to sort of ingest that error and make sense of what had happened there, right? And that's only within the SQL ecosystem. SQL then also runs inside of an OS. So for example, the SQL environment has to worry about things like the Windows OS, memory consumption there, as well as the host that SQL runs on. So SQL has this really complex landscape of telemetry that's available to it. And customers that come from the SQL Server world, so whether that's SQL running in your own data center or running on infrastructure in Azure, have always kind of been used to having all of this data available to them. And Microsoft for 25 years has had a very rich ecosystem of third-party vendors that have built products to sort of offer a lot of value to customers here for monitoring these environments. So when you move up into Azure, a lot of that complexity is still there. In fact, all of that complexity is still there. Where it becomes challenging, though, in the Azure space is the fact that if you think about a PaaS-based deployment of SQL in Azure, customers are pretty much paying for a fully managed service there. So a lot of that complexity, like running the OS, the underlying infrastructure, all of those things are abstracted from customers. But what that also does mean is that some of the information that they require from those different layers has now also been abstracted. So a lot of what we've sort of tried to do, or a lot of what where Azure has sort of, I guess, in the past tried to kind of make sense of all of this is by having us expose what we thought was valuable to customers, right? And that's not it. That has worked for us to a certain degree, but we found that with certain customers, there have just been demand for sort of very specific insights, and that's really where SQL Insights comes in. But before we dive into SQL Insights, I'm going to sort of do a walkthrough of what's available today, and then we can sort of look at where we're moving with our monitoring portfolio. So if you sort of have a look here, this is a database that's deployed into my environment, and this is just a single database. It's an Azure SQL database, not a very big database. It's actually a fairly small database. It's It's a hyperscale. It's got 4 vCores attached to it. And here you can sort of see things like CPU utilization, data IO, log IO percentage, sort of very basic metrics that you can use, right? I will sort of try and define metrics in the easiest way that I can so that we can differentiate between the different pieces of data that you see as well and how they correlate back into SQL. But really, from an Azure perspective, a metric is a continuous numeric sort of set of data that has a dimensionality attached to it. So in the case of something like CPU percentage, you know, the dimensionality is the fact that it's a percentage, right? And it's showing you how much of your CPU you're utilizing at any given point. Now, for all deployments in the Azure space, we emit a standard set of metrics for all databases, right? So customers have access to metrics irrespective of what deployment type they have, whether it's managed instance, whether it's Azure SQL, whether it's, you know, hyperscale, business critical, it doesn't matter. Metrics is something that we make available to all customers. So
gotcha.
we can,
and do you have to configure this, or like by default everyone's going to get this?
Yeah, so by default for all deployment types, metrics are available, right? Like these are your out-of-the-box resources for monitoring anything within Azure, right? So as you can see here, we have a basic metric here. I'm looking at CPU percentage utilized. I can look at the min, I can look at the max of my CPU usage. The average kind of makes a little bit more sense in this case. But really, I get like I said, a continuous set of numbers that tells me what my CPU is doing at any given time. Now, this has a lot of use for customers because it can tell you, you know, what's happening in your environment. But the key thing here is that sort of customers, as part of the Azure portal, as part of Azure Monitor, can go and do alerting on top of these things. So very common use cases that we see here is a customer will say, okay, well, create an alert whenever I have a database that runs at like 90% CPU utilization for more than 3 minutes, or whatever that may be, because that can be a leading indicator for something else that's going on in your database. And that something else is really, I guess, where metrics have their limitations, in that a metric can't tell you what's causing the CPU to be high. It can only tell you that the CPU happens to be high at any given time, right? So, as I said, metrics are valuable in that they can be used for like advanced alerting, but they're not good at telling you why something could potentially be a problem. That's really where logs and X events and some of the other information contained in the DMVs inside of SQL are really, really sort of valuable in this environment. Apart from the metrics, we also have, on every single database, you have this option of deploying what are called diagnostic settings. So diagnostic settings is kind of that next click down if you want. It's a little bit more information than what the metrics provide you, but this is something that we don't offer customers out the box. You have to come in and configure all of these, right? And this can be done sort of very simply. You can see this database, for example, is already going to be emitting some data. Let's say I was interested in my blocking events and my deadlocks, and I can choose where I send that data. So it can either go to log analytics, it can go to a storage account if I wanted to consume it with like a third-party tool like Splunk or whatever that might be, or you can even stream it to event hubs. That's sort of the purpose of the diagnostic settings, is to give you that next layer of click down. But inherently, what you got to understand about the diagnostic settings, and it's important for sort of the further discussion around SQL Insights, is that the content of the diagnostic settings is still something that our product group curates for customers. So we choose what data goes into the diagnostic settings, we choose how that data is aggregated, and we choose how that data gets presented up to the customer. So not a lot of sort of functionality for the customers to choose, you know, oh, I want to see this extra piece of information that you don't have. Like, unfortunately, with the diagnostic settings, they don't get those choices, right? And that's, I guess, one of the downfalls that the diagnostic settings had. Now, I see there's sort of a question that came in about SQL analytics, which is, I guess, the third part that we'll discuss in relation to the existing monitoring story before we move on to SQL Insights. And SQL Analytics is really a sort of a set of products, it was a product set that was built on top of the diagnostic settings, right? So it was really just an easier way for customers to consume the diagnostic settings in sort of a pre-canned fashion.
Right.
Again, the primary problem that we had with SQL Analytics was the fact that all the information we showed there and the sort of the dashboarding and things that we had built on top of it was based on what we wanted to make available to customers, or at least what the system made it easier for us to make available to customers. Now, the specific question here is asking, is SQL Analytics dead? So SQL Analytics as a product is not dead. It's something we will continue to support. But really, when we sort of cover the SQL Insights pieces, you'll see that there is a very compelling reason for all of our customers to be looking at SQL Insights. So the primary thing to understand here is just that, metrics, diagnostic settings, SQL Analytics, all of these sort of historic artifacts that we had were really designed for sort of a very limited subset of use cases. And they weren't necessarily catered for customers that needed like low latency, high velocity telemetry out of their SQL environments.
What is the typical like latency or response, like if I were to use diagnostic settings or metrics?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. So today there's a number of factors that come into that. A lot of the data that you see in diagnostic settings is sort of moving through the backend, right? The Azure design backend for exposing all of this data, and there is latency involved there. So that latency can vary anything from 30 seconds to a couple of minutes, just depending on the specific data type, where it's coming from, how it gets aggregated. So like from a SQL perspective, while for a lot of customers that might be fine, if you're running a highly performant workload, finding out about a deadlock a minute or 90 seconds after it took place is just not a great experience for customers, because a lot can happen in those 90 seconds. So we needed a way to sort of do that much faster, right? And that's really where SQL Insights has kind of fallen into. So I'll cover sort of the basic architecture for SQL Insights. We can have a look at the demos, and sort of hopefully everyone will understand exactly what it is we've tried to build here. So different from what we've done with SQL Analytics or even the diagnostic settings, SQL Insights is a completely customer deployed collection, agent-based telemetry collection system, right? So what we mean by that is that our end customers have access to all the data that we emit. They have access to choosing where that data goes, how frequently that data gets collected. They can even choose which data sets are collected. This is all integrated with the existing Azure monitoring experiences that are available to customers. So all the tools that our customers are used to in Azure Monitor will still work in this environment. So if you use, for example, alerting or workbooks for visualization or anything like that, you can continue to use those tools in Azure Monitor. But we've also sort of, a lot of the access into this data is a lot more open than any of the previous solutions, where I mentioned, for example, customers choose how often they can collect the data. They can also choose where it gets stored, what data they actually collect. But then further to that, you don't even have to utilize the Azure Monitor platform if you don't want to. We have a number of customers out there today who are using this product in its preview that use, for example, Grafana. Now, Grafana is an open source solution that has built-in built-in visualizations, as well as an alerting system. Grafana has a native plugin for log analytics. So what we see customers do here is they collect the data they want, they stream it into log analytics, and then they continue to use Grafana the same way that they've always used it for their alerting and visualization purposes. So very different from SQL Analytics in that, with SQL Analytics, everything that we showed you, how we showed you data, all of those things was sort of pre-packaged. Here, you're getting an experience where you can kind of do whatever it is you want with a solution. And the richness of data here is sort of vastly different from anything we've had before. If you look at diagnostic settings, if you look at metrics and all of these things, I think all up the grand total number of pieces of telemetry that we share throughout those products is just under 100. With SQL Insights out of the box, you're getting access to over 200 different pieces of telemetry, right? So it's very different. And I think if the one message I sort of pass on to people today is, our goal here was never to build something that is all-encompassing and end-to-end, right? Even within the SQL world, that's not something Microsoft sort of ever tried to do, purely because of the complexity around how individual customers look at their environments. That's why we had such a rich ecosystem of ISVs for SQL Server. Here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a workspace where customers control everything in that workspace, and they have all the tools and all the data they need to sort of tailor these these solutions to what it is that they're trying to monitor in their environment. Providing the right data is far more important than having thousands and thousands of in-depth little visualizations that a small percentage of your customers are going to consume on any given day, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good call out, Alain, because I'm sure you'll show us, the UI later, which is really just a piece of it. I think this Azure Monitor agent is, appropriately placed in the center of your architecture, because that's really kind of the key game changer in this situation, right?
Absolutely, right. So the having this this monitoring agent, right? And again, what we've done here from a data collection perspective is that along with the Azure Monitor team, who are busy sort of moving their Azure Monitor agent, or at least this unified agent for log collection and metrics collection and all of these things, they're busy moving that into a GA state. Part of that sort of experience that they have is they have this extensibility framework, which allows other resource providers within Azure to kind of take advantage of all the good things they've built in Azure Monitor. And we'll sort of look at that, things like data collection rules and these things. But they've now allowed us to take something that's very specific to how you monitor a SQL environment and bolt and sort of like build it inside of their agent. So we get all the best parts of the agent, but we also get a very bespoke way of monitoring SQL. And in the case of SQL here, we've actually opted to use an open source solution, right? So we've used the Telegraph agent, which is a very popular OSS agent. And I mean, any customer can come and sort of have a look at the Telegraph plugins, right? So our team has extensively contributed to the SQL Server plugin for Telegraph. And really what you have here is you have a very robust set of sort of collection queries around what data gets collected, how it gets aggregated, all of these things. And I guess a big part of why we decided to go this route instead of building something ourselves is because now that it's open source, customers can sort of see exactly what data we're collecting, how we're aggregating it, and then that will help you make decisions for how you want to visualize some of this data. So all of these queries that we run, these are just standard SQL queries. You can see, for example, here's one of the Telegraph queries that we use in the plugin to kind of show CPU and things like that. All of the data we have here, the way we aggregate it, that's all open source. So any customer can get into this, can sort of come, they can see the repository, they can contribute to the repository if they want. And that's a big sort of part of what we're trying to achieve here is just be as transparent about how we collect this data and everything. And And that's a key part of it, right? Like the Azure Monitor agent, yes, it's central to everything we do, but we're also trying to be as transparent about, sort of the data that we're collecting, where it's being stored and how it's being stored and how customers can access that. So that's why, again, it's an agent based, which is very different from anything we've done before. But we think that the flexibility that this brings is just very different from anything else that we've released in the past.
Right. And Alain, before you go forward, I have a few questions about like how this thing actually works. So you talked about the telegraf is being used from within the Azure Monitor agent, but what's actually happening? How do we do that? How did you guys build this? If you can tell us.
That sort of the Azure Monitor team has kind of been building for many years, right? Like you think about some of the products that they've had out there, like they've had their log agents, they've had the OMS agents. There's been a ton of these agents, and really this Azure Monitor agent is sort of their attempt to kind of unify all of these. And today, yes, this agent sort of has this concept of having a workloads insight platform, which is really just a substrate for running this extensibility framework. But really, you can think of it as almost like a workflow engine. So it understands where it has to go fetch data. It understands what it has to do with the data, and then understands where it has to move the data. So it's this engine for collecting and sort of moving data between 2 points. But very key here again is it's a similar way to what we did things in the past. The difference here now is that this is all managed and maintained by customers. So customers are choosing where they deploy these things. They're choosing where the data flows. So all of that is now in customer control, but it has all the advantages that the sort of the built-in agents that we've been using for years have, right? So it's just, think of it as a collection substrate, with telegraf just being sort of this very SQL-centric portion to the data that we collect. The Azure Monitor agent is not unique to SQL. The sort of the inclusion of the telegraf stuff, yes, that's very SQL-centric, but the Azure Monitor agent is used extensively in Azure for various different collection tasks. So we've just taken advantage of the good work that the Azure Monitor team have done with these agents to sort of bring a better experience to SQL customers inside of Azure.
Makes sense. We also had a few questions from our various streaming places. This question was a while ago, but I think it might be relevant now. He says, I know metrics get logged in 2 places. Which ones are being pulled for SQL Insights?
So it's a good question, and I think if I understand it correctly, I think the sort of the differentiation that customers have to make here is that SQL Insights stands apart from the traditional metrics that we collect, right? So irrespective of whether customer deploys SQL Insights or not, the standard metrics that get emitted for every single deployment in Azure will still continue to be there. SQL Insights, on the other hand, I guess a way to think of it is sort of like metrics plus, right? Like you get this far richer experience, right? Like where, we can go back and I can show you here. If we look at this database, you will sort of see, oh dear. So let me just get it up. If you look at this database, for example, you can see here that these metrics that are being exposed on the database by default, as I said, these are available to everyone, and there's sort of no overhead or no charge for running these metrics, but there's only a limited subset of them, right?
Right.
So these are for all things. Now, if you deploy SQL Insights, you're going to get, an additional 200 different sort of points that you can start monitoring. So you just have to kind of differentiate between the traditional metrics that are there for everything and then sort of the things that SQL Insights are going to bring to sort of augment these data sets.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then a follow-up question that I saw that I think is related to this is, once we have, if we're using SQL Insights, does that mean we can turn off things like diagnostics settings because it's completely separate?
Correct. Yeah. So I mean, that's the there is a lot of overlap in the data that we expose through diagnostic settings in SQL Insights. So again, like one of our sort of North Star recommendations to customers is that, SQL Insights is where we're going to be investing significantly because of all the benefits that it brings to customers, like the control over what's being deployed and where you're consuming it, and all of those things that we've discussed earlier. We're sort of seeing patterns in the industry around, this seems to be where, generally speaking, the OSS communities and a lot of the dev communities and sort of big hyperscale customers are trying to move. So this product is really sort of trying to address a more modern approach to how we do all of this. So while diagnostic settings are not going anywhere, there are significant benefits to using SQL Insights instead of diagnostic settings, largely around things like latency and collection times and things like that. So I guess evaluate every scenario case by case. Some might be fine for diagnostic settings, especially like in dev or pre-prod environments. But if you have these really mission critical things that you need data like super fast, super responsive, SQL Insights is definitely going to be the recommendation going forward from our group.
Okay, gotcha. And so just to wrap on this, there's one more question, then let's move on to something else. But I think the question is more generally around like migrating from, whether it's diagnostics or Azure SQL Analytics, like how do you see that process going?
Yes, it's an interesting question. So I mean, like again, like we see these as sort of complementary and yet standalone deployment types. So for any customer that's using any of the existing products and they want to move over to SQL Insights, our recommendation there would always be, try run the two solutions side by side for like a period of time, 30 days or whatever it is. Like by default, some of the diagnostic settings only have 30 days worth of retention inside Log Analytics anyways. So if you run SQL Insights and your diagnostic settings side by side for 30 days, you should have the same two sets of data sets collected there. And, you can then decide at that point, like, everything that I need to kind of move forward with SQL Insights, is it available, or should I stick to diagnostic settings, right? So while we don't have a direct migration path for customers, the advice we're sort of trying to give all customers is just, run the two solutions side by side, have a look at what your outputs are, and have a look at whether what you're getting out of both systems or what you were getting out of the old system and the new system still add value to what you're trying to do.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense then. A few people have commented that this is super helpful. So thanks, Alain. I do want to get into how you actually set this thing up because we haven't seen it yet. Maybe while you're getting that started, one question which I'm not sure you'll be able to answer is, how soon do you expect this to come out of preview?
So it's a good question. Like, I mean, so definitely our goal is to kind of do that. And I wouldn't say as fast as possible. There are some things that we're still trying to do. And I mean, I'm happy to sort of look at some of the things that we're trying to achieve before we go GA. Our goal at the moment is still to try hit GA, within this calendar year. If we don't kind of hit that time zone, it'll be early next year. So, there's some things that are kind of up in the air at the moment about the full scope of GA. I mean, we have a very sort of robust monitoring North Star that we're kind of going after. And we're just kind of trying to prioritize between, how much do we want to pull back into the GA versus actually going GA. So definitively, I don't have a fixed date right now, but before the end of the calendar year or very early next calendar year is what we're aiming at.
Awesome, cool. And maybe at the end, if we have time, we'll get to poke at what you think the future and that North Star, more information about that. But in the meantime, I'd love to see, like, how do we set this thing up? What does it look like? Can you take us through it?
Yeah, absolutely. So here, if you just from the sort of Azure homepage, I can just come into Azure Monitor. Again, this was a very collaborative effort between the SQL team and the Azure Monitor team. So everything that SQL Insights does is very highly sort of integrated into their environment. So all the kind of bells and whistles that customers are used to from the Azure Monitor environment will sort of work on top of the SQL Insights data that we collect. So here from the Azure Monitor space, you'll kind of see we have this new thing that says SQL Preview. One of the things that we're going to be unlocking in the coming, I guess, sort of coming period before we go GA is to actually have a direct link from individual resources to this, right? So that you don't have to navigate through Azure Monitor, but you can navigate from your database, for example, to Azure Monitor. So here we go SQL Insights. And I'm fortunate enough that in my environment, I have multiple instances of SQL Insights that have already been set up. So I don't have to actually come and do any of the setup, but I'll still show you what that looks like. So if you sort of take a look at this one here, here you can see an environment that's sort of pre-configured already. Today, we're monitoring 7 Azure SQL databases and 29 databases spread across 3 different managed instances, right? One of the key things that you're going to notice here that's very different from anything we've done before, that includes metrics, diagnostics, as well as SQL analytics, is we now have the ability to monitor SQL Server. So today that's limited to SQL Server running inside virtual machines hosted in Azure, but we're hoping as part of our hybrid story that we'll give customers the ability to be able to deploy the agent in their existing data centers. And then you can sort of have this single unified monitoring experience of what you're doing on-premise as well as what you're doing in Azure, right? Because one of the key things we've tried to do here by sort of adopting the telgraf agent for collecting data is we've tried to unify the surface area of what exactly it is we're collecting from SQL and how we go about doing that. So the way we monitor Azure SQL Database Managed Instance and SQL Server is exactly the same. All of those queries are open source. Any customer can go and look at them. The only thing that differs between the environments is the deployment scope. So, for example, if you're looking at an Azure SQL database, the concept of having instance-based telemetry just doesn't exist because there is no instance. Your resource is at the database level. So managed instance and SQL Server will have very similar data sets. But SQL Server still, as you can see here, for example, has data sets around availability groups, which in the Azure space just doesn't make any sense for us to expose because our SLA covers the fact that Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance are highly available and they are covered by our 4.9 SLA all the time. So why would we even show that information here? Whereas SQL Server running on IaaS, that's still something customers have to think about. So the first concept that we sort of have to think about is this concept of having a monitoring profile, right? Now, the monitoring profiles are built on top of the data collection rules for Azure Monitor. And the way I like to think of these profiles is more of think of them almost as a policy for data collection, right? So what you get for these profiles is you basically create all the criteria for the data collection that you want to do. So the first thing you have to do is, as with any resource in Azure, you have to choose where it gets deployed. And for example, it would be region and the name of the profile and all of these things. But then you also set up the destination. And the destination in this case is where's that data going to flow to? Today, within the scope of the private preview, we only support the movement of data to log analytics. But again, as part of what we're looking at is different places to store data. Because we know that some customers already have systems in place that don't require something like log analytics in the middle. So potentially in the future, there's a roadmap for us to stream data out into storage or move data into Azure Data Explorer. So there are options we're looking at here. And again, this is all about customer flexibility, right? Customer gets to choose where that data goes and lives. Along with this, you get to choose the retention on that data. Do I store the data for 30 days? Do I store it for 60 days? Log Analytics has retention policies all the way up to 999 days, right? So you can store this data for a long time and do sort of historical analysis over things like, how is my storage usage increasing? How is my CPU usage increasing? And that helps a lot of customers make sort of longer term decisions about their environments that they're in. And then the last piece, which I guess is probably the most interesting piece around this profile, is the actual collection settings. Now, the collection settings determine what data is being collected per deployment type, as well as the frequency that we collect that data at. So, you can have a different set of data that you're collecting per DB to managed instance to SQL server. So for example, if you're not running availability groups, you wouldn't collect the data sets for availability groups, right?
Right.
But let's say you wanted requests and schedulers. You can add those data sets and you can have multiple of these profiles running, right, for different environments. And the reason that that's important is because strong feedback that we got from customers was that, they don't uniformly monitor everything in their environment, right? Like dev and test get monitored differently to production. And, to sort of potentially save costs or complexity of deployment, you wouldn't want to monitor a dev environment at like a 5-second interval because it just doesn't make sense. You're not
Right.
running a production workload. You don't want to do those type of things there. Whereas your production environment, you would want all the data and you would want it as fast as possible, right? So you can have multiple of these profiles doing different environments, right? So today we allow 30 seconds, but I mean, we've also exposed the actual config file so that you can come and set the collection interval per deployment type. So let's say you wanted SQL DB to collect on a 10-second frequency, and you wanted, for example, your VMs to collect on a 50-second interval. You can actually come and set it at that fine-grained level within the actual config file if you sort of have a bit more understanding about how these config files work. Right? And that's sort of the primary concept behind these profiles, right? They're monitoring, I guess policy is the wrong word, but that's really what they're doing is they're enforcing how you collect data for the scope of the profile that you've created, right? And that's a really interesting concept for us because, some of the things that we're thinking about doing in the future is about how do I automatically register new resources and things like that. And that's really where this is going to change from just being sort of a static profile to more of a policy-based set of monitoring. That is the sort of the high level of how you deploy, right? Once you have this profile, that profile will be pushed down onto the actual agent where that Azure Monitor agent is running. And that profile tells the agent what to collect, where to collect it from, how often to collect it, where to send it, right? That's what the profile does. And as I said, in this specific environment, we have already got a number of sort of set up databases that are being monitored. And the whole goal behind this is, as I mentioned earlier, is the let me go back a step. What we were trying to achieve here was not to build a sort of end-to-end solution, but really what we've tried to do is build almost like a guided experience for customers so that it becomes easier for you to find where your problems are, right? Not a fully encompassing solution, as I said, but you, for example, here, let's say I had a number of alerts that were set up in my environment, and these alerts were designed to, if you look at these alerts, let's say under the templates, there's one here that says, this alert should fire whenever my CPU runs at 95% for more than 3 consecutive collection periods, right? Now, if that alert fired, I would, for example, be able to see here that I had an alert that fired. And what the whole point here is the UX is trying to guide me to where I need to go pay attention, right?
Gotcha.
So I can come in, I can now see all of my deployments in this environment. I would be able to see if they're online, are they primaries or secondaries? That's another
What does
very
that
interesting.
mean? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that's another very interesting point in that, unlike any of the other solutions we have available today, we actually allow customers to now monitor their secondaries as well, right? So if you think about Azure-based deployments where you have the business critical tier, which is all which comes with one readable secondary that customers can access for read-only workloads. We now allow you to actually monitor those secondaries as well. The same with hyperscale. Today, there is a bit of a limitation. Even though our hyperscale deployments support multiple secondaries, up to 4, we can only monitor one primary and one secondary per deployment. We're hoping that sort of as we move to GA, that's something we'll solve, unless a customer is using named replicas, which is in preview. They can then monitor as many as they want, right? So you can see here, you can distinguish between your primaries and your secondaries. And from here, I can sort of see a high-level overview of how all my Azure SQL databases are doing, right? So I can see memory usage, I can see CPU usage, I can see things like transactions per second, batch requests per second across the entire set of Azure SQL databases. But if I wanted to now do another drill down, I could further drill down into an individual database. And now I can see data very specific just to this database. So now I'm looking at just the one database. I can see sort of how much space it's using, all of the sort of data that is pertinent only to this database. I have weight stats. I have various sort of other things that are very specific to one deployment, like memory clerks and all of these. And I'm happy to sort of discuss this, but part of what we're going to be adding in the coming months is all the QDS data. So if customers want to be doing sort of very in-depth query analysis on an individual database, that'll be a new data set that we'll start exposing. So customers will be able to see things like, top resource consuming queries per database, top running queries, all of these sort of very specific performance-based metrics will start becoming available as well, right? And that'll just give you that next level of click down, right? Like, how do I get to a point where if something is wrong in my environment, I am like 95% of the way to understand what it is and where it has happened and how I can go about solving it. The other thing, and I did mention this earlier as well, is that we collect a lot of data for SQL Insights, right? So you sort of have a look here under the Explore Metrics tab, which is sort of just an open exploration tool that we have. The entire UX that we've exposed today only uses about 30 to 35% of all the data we collect. So under the covers, we're actually collecting a lot more data than what we're actually using to do these visualizations on, right? And that goes back to the point I made earlier. This is more about providing a platform with the right tools for customers to monitor their environments in a way that makes sense for them than it is for us to build an out-of-the-box experience. As I said, a lot of some of the customers that we engage with don't even use these workbooks. They use Grafana sitting on top of the log analytics. And that's kind of the last major point that I'm going to touch on, is this concept of having all your data available to you. If you look at all of these graphs and the way we're exposing these graphs, they are just standard KQL queries running on top of the data that's sitting inside of the log analytics. So as an end customer, you can come and you can change any of these visualizations. Let's say you wanted to see the max instead of the average for that specific chart. You can just come in and update the KQL query and sort of save that into environment and share that new version of the dashboard with people inside of your organization, right? So it's all about having this, I guess, almost like an experience where, we're going to be providing you with some templatized examples of how to do this. But really the goal here is for customers to take this and really build something that makes sense in their environment, right? You can change everything in this experience, right? From the layout of the buttons to the specific splices that we offer at the top of each blade. All of these things are customizable by our customers now. So again, this is just these are the visualizations that we thought would be useful for customers, but they're not the be all and end all of what we're seeing customers ask us for. So all of these workbooks are posted on GitHub as well. So, we're kind of hoping that over time we start sort of developing this community where people are posting sort of useful visualizations into that Git repository so that other people can go and sort of just pull it out and put it in their environment if they want, right? But ultimately, you don't have to use our visualizations at all.
Right.
If you have another visualization engine that can ingest the data from log analytics, by all means, that you can continue to use that product. And that's, I think, fundamentally a big part of what we're trying to achieve here is just, try to be as open about all of this as possible, try and share as much of this data with customers as possible, and just make it as easy for customers to get to the data and consume the data in a way that makes sense for them. It's in the last 2 years that I've been engaging customers on this project, it's become super apparent to us that there's no customer that does this the same way. Every customer has their little corner case or their little niche thing. And for us to try and build every single one of those is just going to take us a ton of time. So we sort of went the other way and we said, okay, here's everything you need. Go and do what makes sense in your environment.
Right. And Alain, just a few things I wanted to highlight from what you said, because I think they were really interesting call outs. All of this is editable. I liked how you showed us that edit button, so you can actually configure those queries that are running underneath. And then I also really liked the mention about the workbooks on GitHub, because maybe you could see like a community effort of people who have these kind of different scenarios that are then developing workbooks that you can use to kind of address like a very specific performance scenario or something like that. We do have a few questions that had come in.
Sure.
One, there's 3 at the moment, but the first one was asking about your mention of secondaries, so you can only monitor one secondary, and I think that is true. But one side question I had is, I set this up and I had some like geo-replicated databases, and it was also able to pick up those as secondaries. But I think the question is just like, is there only one secondary supported, and what do you think about that going forward?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of, so when I say one secondary, I'm referring to one secondary per DNS namespace, right? So if you think about an Azure SQL deployment, if I deploy a business critical today, I get in one availability group, I have one primary and 3 secondaries, of which one of those secondaries is available for read-only workloads. In that scenario, I would be able to monitor that primary and that secondary, because there's only one primary and the secondary that's available there. If I then deployed that as a geo pair in a different region, that geo pair in the second region would have a different namespace. So SQL Insights would still be able to monitor that geo environment in the same way that it does the primary environment. Just one of the challenges we have today is if there's multiple of these. So like you take a hyperscale deployment today where under a single namespace, you can have up to 4 secondaries. That kind of like there's some logic that we need to figure out in the back there, and how we sort of stably come up with a way to identify like primary or secondary 1 from secondary 4, for example, right? So it's just some work that we're sort of trying to get through on the back end, but we have a plan to kind of get to that. And the sort of the full scope of what we're looking at is like, okay, well, we want to be able to support all the deployment types within Azure.
Right. Nope, that makes sense. And then another question, and maybe this is a question that you might see among a lot of people that are coming from monitoring their SQL Server resources to monitoring their Azure SQL resources. But someone asked, what query language were you using in log analytics?
Oh, right. Yeah. So log analytics is pretty much running KQL today, which is the language for the same language that we use in Azure Data Explorer today, and log analytics. So this is something that's, I guess, kind of specific to these products, but it is very SQL-esque as a language. and it's just KQL in the backend, right? So there's a bunch of data, a bunch of documentation that that you can consume on how to write these KQL queries. But really, it's if you can write SQL statements, KQL is not light years away from that. So there might be some learning curve, but that's also where we're hoping this sort of community-based approach to sort of people contributing some work that they do in these areas will come in very handy for a lot of the customers that we deal with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I also, as someone who's kind of played around with customizations in this space, using the templates that exist makes it even easier because, like you said, it's very logical to kind of change things. Oh, I don't want the average, I want the max, I want the min, or I want to look at this other thing. So you kind of manipulate and go from there. Okay, this last question that we have right now, I'm not sure if this is something you have for us today, but they ask, can you show an example of adding a connection for adding a SQL instance to be monitored?
Sure. I mean, that's fine. It is all in our documentation, and we will put a link to get to the documentation and stuff in the description of this video. But I mean, I'm happy to show that if we kind of go back here. It's part of my profile. So I want to configure here. And what you're going to see here is so today this experience is still fairly, I want to say, manual. It's something that we're working on towards GA to make this a lot more automated. So the actual registration of databases and things is going to become a lot easier for customers, where you'll just have drop downs and it'll auto discover in subscriptions and you can just tick things and go. But the experience today, at least within the sort of the scope of the beginning of the preview, is still to kind of add these sort of like in this way here, right? Like where you would have a connection string, and this connection string is pretty much going to be pointing towards a database, right? So whether that's an Azure SQL database, whether that's a managed instance, or whether that's a SQL server running on IaaS, those connection strings are just sort of standard SQL driver connection strings. And they kind of take the database name, they take the password and sort of the standard things. In my example, and this again is all documented, we actually use Key Vault, right, to secure the passwords. And in fact, you can use Key Vault to secure everything from the username to the password to the physical connection string if you wanted. This is just sort of a standard JSON markup, so you can just kind of keep referencing parameters that are sitting in your key vaults inside the connection strings, and that way you can make it a lot more dynamic. But as I said, while today it's a fairly manual process to kind of do a lot of these things, the goal is by the time we go preview this GA, this will be a lot more automated, where we'll auto construct these connection strings and things like that in the backend, so the customers don't really have to worry about doing a lot of those things.
Awesome, cool. Thanks, Alain. We got a lot of questions today, so I think people are pretty excited about SQL Insights. I had one question. You've mentioned like a few times this idea of like Telegraf and Grafana. Like, can you share any insights, no pun intended, on how like the team feels about open telemetry and open metrics?
Yes, I mean it's a good question. It's a very good question. So anyone who kind of follows what's happening in the broader world, right? Like, as someone who's been working on SQL for over a decade, it's super easy to get very like specific on one topic. But a lot of what we're sort of looking at is like, well, where's the industry moving? How's the industry thinking about these sort of things, just outside of databases in general? Now, there's an initiative out there. In fact, there's a couple of initiatives that are sort of busy being stabilized and contributed to, that fall under this sort of general concept of open telemetry and open metrics and these sort of things. And really what it's about is it's about standardizing the interface for things like tracing and how data is surfaced up through databases. And I think a lot of what we're as a team collectively thinking about is, while SQL has this really robust and this really sort of depth of telemetry that it sits on, it is very specific to SQL, and it is very niche to people who understand SQL and how SQL works and things like that. So we're sort of thinking about how we potentially align some of our future efforts to these kind of initiatives, and how do we really bring our the SQL observability story sort of into this sort of modern era where telemetry is just used and consumed very differently. And I think there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that the telemetry that applications and databases and everything, networks and storage and everything is emitting, a lot of companies are starting to see that data as being equally as valuable as the data that's actually sitting inside the database to run the application. So there's a lot of thought process that we're putting in there. Nothing's been finalized yet, but we are looking at it. We are thinking about the all-up portfolio that is the SQL telemetry, and how we potentially in the future just have a better story, whether it's for developers, DBAs, network admins, storage admins, doesn't really matter. Just have a better story in general with how people deal with telemetry coming out of databases.
Interesting. You kind of took us into the future a little bit. I'm really interested to see where that goes. So people will have to stay tuned and follow what happens in the monitoring story. Alain, we did have one more question before we kind of start to wrap up. This question is from David, and he says, is there insight support for Synapse Analytics SQL pool, or is that something that's coming soon?
So again, I work on the SQL team. I can't comment for the Synapse team, but the platform that we've built here should be something that the Synapse team can utilize and use to monitor their can open up so that customers can monitor those environments. While my team is not actively doing it, we have engaged with them. We have started these discussions. I don't have any sort of idea on timelines, but the goal here is to, like I said, to get to a point where SQL-based deployments of databases, right, are kind of uniformly exposing their observability stories to customers.
Right. No, I think that makes sense. And Alain, we just have a few minutes left, but I did want to kind of end by one, sharing this URL, which is a link to the documentation where you can learn how to set this up step by step, learn how it works, learn more information about it. But do you have any final tips for viewers who are maybe just getting started with this on how they should approach it or think about it, or really anything?
Well, I mean, it's really, I think sort of the best advice I can give anyone at the moment is just kind of go have a look at the documentation and sort of try and see how this is going to fit in your environment, if it's a good match, if it's not a good match. And then, I mean, our team's super happy to take any feedback on this. We do feel that this is becoming a very important aspect for certain customers. So, I mean, I would just tell people, like, go out, test it, have a run with the product, read through the documentation, provide us with feedback, and we'll sort of, hopefully by the time we go GA, we'll have something that's so super easy for customers to use. Super, a lot of the confusion will be removed by then. So yeah, I mean, just test it, have a look at the docs. That's the best advice I've got for anyone right now.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Alain, for coming on the show. This was really interesting for me. I learned a lot. I think you were able to give us a lot of context and kind of glimpses under the hood. So hopefully that helps people as they go think about how they're going to manage their monitoring solutions in the future. For our viewers, if you like this video, go ahead and give it a like, leave us a comment, let us know what you want to see next. And we'll be right back here at the same time, same place, after build. Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.
Thanks, Anna.